Chapter 7 of Earthquake Terror. Dad won't be back. The knowledge filled Jonathan with alarm. He stood at the edge of the embankment looking at the broken bridge and knew there was no way Dad's car or any other vehicle would come to the island now. Not today, not tomorrow, not for many weeks or maybe even months. There was no way for Jonathan and Abby to walk off the island either. They would have to wait for someone in a boat or a helicopter to rescue them. Jonathan's knees felt weak, and he plopped onto the ground as all hope for a fast rescue vanished. Jonathan looked into the rushing water. Had Mom and Dad made it safely across the bridge before the earthquake tore it in two? If a car had been on the bridge when it broke, the car would have plunged into the river, would have sunk quickly to the bottom. A person with a broken ankle would have a hard time climbing out of a car that was underwater. A person with a broken ankle would probably not be able to swim to shore. Stop it, Jonathan told himself. He turned and started back to Abby. Fear formed a hollow place in his chest. Until now, Jonathan had thought if no one came to rescue them, he would walk across the bridge and hike to Beaverville and bring help back for Abby. He would have been a hero. Courageous boy walks 20 miles to save sister, details at 6. Well, forget the hero bit. That plan was no longer an option. Jonathan felt far more hopeless, knowing he had to wait for help to come to him, than he had felt when there was some action he could take. Weighed down by his new disaster, Jonathan walked more slowly on the return trip. Twice the V-shaped twigs served to direct him. Each time he came to one, he snapped it into several pieces. He had to be sure he didn't start going in circles, following the same twig more than once. Moose heard Jonathan coming and came to greet him. Jonathan knelt and hugged the dog, burying his face in the soft fur, inhaling the familiar doggy scent. Some boss, he whispered. She didn't even hold on to your leash. Moose licked Jonathan's arm. Abby was asleep. Wearily, Jonathan crawled into the shelter and lay beside her. The sun was low in the sky. Where were Mom and Dad? They made it off the island, but that didn't necessarily mean they had made it to the hospital. It was 20 miles from the bridge in Beaverville, and that road could be impassable as the road between the bridge and the campground. He had not found a smashed car on the island, but maybe the car was smashed somewhere else, or maybe it was at the bottom of the Tuscan River. If his parents could send help, they would. Jonathan knew that. He also knew they might not be able to send help, and if that were so, Jonathan must somehow help himself. I need to make a sign that we're here. That way, even if Mom and Dad haven't made it to town yet, someone in a plane might spot the signal and realize we need help. A fire, perhaps. Smoke would be seen a long way off, and a fire would be noticed even after dark. He had learned in Cub Scouts how to create sparks by rubbing stones together. He could gather twigs and start a fire. He crept out of the shelter without waking Abby and quickly gathered a pile of dry leaves. It was easy to find twigs for kindling, and he soon had a teepee of twigs built over his leaf pile. But as Jonathan bent to pick up a larger branch, he realized how dry the forest floor was. There had been no rain for months. He couldn't build a fire, not with the forest so dry. One wayward spark and the whole island would go up in flames. Jonathan kicked his pile of twigs and leaves and scattered them in a circle. He needed a clearing. He needed a big open space where he could take large sticks and spell out help. The lake shore. There was a wide stretch of beach between the end of the trail and the edge of the lake. It would be perfect. He could make the sign and start a fire too, to draw attention to the sign. He would build the fire close to the lake and put wet sand all around it to keep it from spreading. Jonathan scooped up some of the dry leaves and twigs and stuffed them into his backpack. He gathered an armload of inch-thick sticks for firewood. He hurried through the woods toward the lake, following the path he had cleared earlier when he and Abby returned to camp. Alone, he covered the distance quickly. He saw the big redwood tree that he and Abby hid under during the earthquake. Just beyond it, he saw water. Jonathan stopped and stared. The earthquake hadn't hit until he and Abby were far down the trail, well away from the lake. He shouldn't be able to see water already. Yet there it was. Jonathan dropped his sticks and plunged through the brush until he reached the big redwood. He scrambled up on the trunk and stood looking across what had been the trail. The lake was different than before. It was closer. Water now covered the forest floor where he and Abby had first struggled to walk. Broken branches bobbed on the surface. Jonathan slid down the far side of the redwood. Splash! His feet landed in an inch of boggy water. He slogged forward, curious to see where the water came from. Had the earthquake rearranged the lake? He continued walking until the water was ankle deep. Then he climbed partway up a maple tree and looked west. With so many trees down, the forest was not so dense and he could see clearly. What he saw sent chills down the back of his neck. The sandy beach was underwater. The junction of stream and lake where he and Abby played Sink the Ships was underwater. And a large portion of Magpie Island was underwater. The lake was much bigger than it had been before. It was far larger even than it got in winter when the Tuscan River was at its deepest. In his mind, Jonathan saw the layout of Magpie Island as it looked on the map. It sat in the middle of the wide Tuscan River. One small stream, Magpie Creek, flowed across the island into Magpie Lake, and then flowed out the other side where it rejoined the Tuscan. If Magpie Lake was suddenly expanding, the river must have changed. What had happened? Had harmless Magpie Creek suddenly overflowed its banks? Jonathan watched the water inch closer. What if the earthquake had created a natural dam of fallen trees? What if the Tuscan was flowing into Magpie Creek and from there into Magpie Lake, as it always had, but no water was flowing out on the other side? There would be no place else for that water to go except to overflow on the island. Jonathan took a step backward. How big would the lake get? How long would a dam hold? How close to the campground would the water come? Magpie Island was only a few miles wide, and the only bridge connecting the island to land was broken. The Tuscan River was a huge river, big enough for houseboat rental companies to flourish. If it was now flowing into Magpie Lake, the lake might get big enough, deep enough that the whole island would eventually be underwater. Magpie Island would disappear, possibly forever. Water lapped at the tree trunk below him. Jonathan stared down at it. The lake was definitely moving toward him. Jonathan climbed down the tree and sloshed through the woods toward his sister. He could not spell out help when there was no longer any land between the lake shore and the woods. He needed someone to talk to, someone who could give him some advice. He needed to tell someone that Magpie Lake had overflowed its banks, and he and Abby were trapped in its path, and he wasn't sure what to do next. The thought of tidal waves jumped into his mind. He remembered pictures on the classroom bulletin board of a tidal wave following an earthquake. In Jamaica, he thought. His teacher had talked about an earthquake in Alaska, too, where parts of the ocean floor rose 50 feet. But Magpie Island was 60 miles from the ocean. Surely a tidal wave wouldn't surge that far upriver, causing a flood and wiping out everything in its path, would it? Jonathan wished he had been more interested last year when his teacher had talked about earthquakes. Mrs. Higgins had even offered a chance to earn extra credit by doing a report on earthquakes. But it had been in the spring, at the start of baseball season, when Jonathan didn't have a lot of extra time. He took deep breaths, trying to stay calm. Surely help would arrive soon. Even with the bridge out, Mom and Dad would make sure that he and Abby were rescued. By now, rescuers were probably on the way. Maybe he'll have to be airlifted in a helicopter, Jonathan thought. That would be exciting. He didn't care how they got out. He just hoped it would happen soon. If it didn't and the water kept coming, Jonathan ran faster. He couldn't just wait for rescues to come. What if the water got there first? Abby was awake when he returned to the shelter. "Where's my drink?" she asked. Jonathan opened the backpack, threw out the dry leaves he had gathered, and gave Abby one of the 2 remaining juice packs. He had planned to save his parents' juice until he was desperate. But Abby was thirsty, and she would be certain to have a tantrum if she didn't get something to drink. I'm desperate now, Jonathan thought. The river is flooding, and half the island is underwater, and Abby can't swim. He opened the last juice pack and carefully poured some into his cupped hand for Moose, who lapped it up eagerly. Jonathan drank the rest himself as the thought repeated itself in his brain. Abby can't swim.